Let's have a conversation. Tell me what you think about the issues of the world. What kind of spice you wanna be? Tell me where you wanna travel. Do you believe in luxury? What's your hidden passion? What makes you so unique? Conversations with Nicole. Conversations with Nicole. Conversations with Nicole. Conversations with Nicole.
Greetings. Welcome to Conversations with Nicole. I am Nicole Everett, your host, and today's very special guest currently serves as the Transformation Officer for the Crisis Text Line. However, she also is a Stanford graduate, Harvard-trained internist and pediatrician. She has a master's in public health. She served with the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice as the Office of Health Services. Actually helped create that office, as well as with the Florida Department of Health. She was the Deputy Secretary for Health, and she's had extensive training and work done within a childhood trauma space. But help me welcome Ms. Dr. Shairi Turner Davis. Welcome.
Thank you, Nicole. It's truly a pleasure to be here.
So, from New York originally, but tell me a little bit more about who Shairi is. And I love that name, by the way.
Yeah, so thank you. Shairi actually means a song or a line of poetry in Swahili. And when we started this conversation, when you asked me the question about who I am and what my name means, it actually prompted me to look back on what does it mean to have a name, a song or a line of poetry in the context of my career. And thank you for that incredible introduction. But looking back in the history of my career, it's a song or a line of poetry can be seen as advocacy, words, the spoken word. Everything that I've done, when I look back at it, has been around advocacy. So becoming a physician was to help people learn about their health. The work that I did at the Department of Juvenile Justice was around advocating for youth, advocating for children with trauma histories, with abuse and neglect in their past and present. My work at the Department of Health was around advocacy for large population health. My work in trauma is advocating for children and adults who've experienced abuse. And then my work as the Chief Medical Officer and currently as the Chief Transformation Officer, it's advocacy for people in need. It's advocacy for those who are isolated, alone, and need help.
Yeah. So again, your resume just is extensive and speaks for itself. But I want to dive in, just off the rip, in the whole childhood trauma piece, because I think that not enough attention is paid to that. I've become more aware of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs as they are called, in more recent years. So I'd like you to speak to that just kind of briefly, and how it impacts not only children, but adults.
Yes. So over half of U.S. children have experienced some type of childhood trauma. So when we talk, Nicole, about childhood trauma, we're speaking about experiences that children have between the time that they are in utero, essentially, until the age of 25. And I picked those parameters because that is the key time when the brain is developing. So we now know that abuse, physical, sexual, emotional abuse, the witnessing of violence, the witnessing of parental domestic violence, loss of a parent, incarceration of a parent, a parent who has mental illness. All of these factor into the child's brain development and brain health. And to know that over half of US children have experienced at least one of those, and then to make the connection, knowing that those traumas can layer upon each other and all contribute to the physical and mental health of both children and adults. They impact learning, they impact behavior, they impact things such as depression, anxiety, drug use, teen pregnancy, obesity, diabetes, hypertension. Trauma, we will come to see and acknowledge fully, will be the #1 public health issue, the #1 thing that physicians need to screen for ultimately. And we're moving in that direction as a country, but ultimately we have to all recognize childhood trauma as a public health issue.
Thanks for sharing that. Now, I'd also like you to speak to, the impact of untreated trauma.
Right. So what happens when, this speaks to resilience. So when trauma is untreated, meaning people get into adulthood with significant histories of abuse or neglect or family dysfunction, like I outlined before, it impacts their both continuing the cycle. So it impacts the decisions that are made sometimes in terms of getting into an additional cycle of violence. It impacts parenting styles. If people don't recognize, or we're not bringing an awareness to both children and adults about those connections between trauma and physical health and mental health, and we're not focusing our efforts in the schools and in the medical and mental health community around wrapping around families instead of incarcerating adults or incarcerating children who have significant behavioral disorders that originate from trauma. If we don't address that, we're missing the foundational problem, where we could be providing support early on, focusing our energies, our resources, and our monies, our funds early on in childhood to address and support families where trauma is identified. And that can either be through the school system, identified through the schools, or identified through their primary care physicians and pediatricians.
So how can, you mentioned the schools, which I think they have quite a responsibility because, a lot of times they may witness some activities that the children or behaviors that the children are exhibiting, and it may be a direct result of some abuse or trauma that is taking. What's being done, if you're aware, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but to bring schools maybe up to speed on being trauma informed or providing trauma informed care, or notifying maybe the authorities or the appropriate personnel to assist children that may be going through traumatic experiences at home.
Right. So that's an excellent.
I shouldn't just say at home, in the community, because there could be instances just in their neighborhoods or in their environments where they witness shootings or someone being murdered or some type of physical abuse or violence and that sort of thing. So.
Right. So not enough, and it's not evenly distributed. So more and more educators and mental health providers are becoming aware of the connection between trauma and behavior that are going to be red flags in the community and in the school system. But we're still not focusing immediately on the fact that it might be a trauma issue, it might be a family dysfunction, a family that needs support. It may, in fact, the behavior, right, especially for children of color, where teachers see the behavior, look for the behavior, and instead of thinking first, is this a child who's stressed at home? Is this a child who's distressed? Is this a family that needs support? They focus directly on the behavior of the child and move into a more punitive model, right? The pipeline, the school to prison pipeline is real. And it's because of this fact, because we're seeing teachers are identifying behaviors, and there's racial disparities in the way that they identify the behaviors and the way the school system addresses the behaviors of Black children or children of color and white children. So where the schools, I hope eventually will always wrap around a child who's exhibiting distress or behavioral issues, we're not there yet, not uniformly across the state, not uniformly across the country, but the conversations, the awareness is being raised more and more. But it's a process. The Adverse Childhood Experiences study was done in 1996. It really wasn't until the early 2000s that the concept of adverse childhood experiences seeped outside of that sentinel study done by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente, where it started to be addressed and acknowledged within the school system or within the mental health community.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. I have so many questions, but you mentioned the racial disparities, and I think that's a very key issue that probably gets overlooked. I think 2020 and all that's gone on with the pandemic and the social and racial unrest has definitely highlighted the need to have these types of conversations and look for some more equitable ways for us to engage and try to eliminate some of the systemic racism within American culture, right? Gosh, I don't even know how to formulate the question that I want to ask, but
we need to have a part two conversation.
We do. But I think specifically around any best practices maybe that you've run across of, in the education space or, institution of education where racial disparities are being eliminated or there being some type of mitigation to help change the bias, the discrimination, the prejudice that we see in the education realm, or across any other the systems that we have to deal with, as a nation.
And you touched on very key points, Nicole. Really and truly, we are looking at what's a groundwater issue. Structural and historical racism is a groundwater issue, meaning that it is deep in the wells and the foundation of our country. Mm-hmm. It's been built into the systems that then feed all of these institutions. So each of the institutions, whether it's the school system, the healthcare system, the justice system, approaches these disparities in isolation instead of recognizing the 400 years of history that have brought us to this point, right? So what we see when we see a child who is experiencing distress, who's traumatized in a classroom and is acting out, and our first inclination is to look at the child. What's the problem with the child, right? Instead of looking much more broadly and holistically about what is the system around the child? What is the system in our society? How did we get to this point from a foundational history of structural racism, right? We cannot disconnect those two things, right? We're looking, if we're looking individually at the child or even just at the family, we're not addressing the context in which that family lives, in which the community around that family supports or doesn't support the family. To point at an individual, even to point at, you know, the education system is missing this larger groundwater issue that we as a country have to address. We as a world have to address. George Floyd awakened people to what African Americans and people of color have known for a long time, the racial injustices and the abuse that we have experienced in this country. For in this instance, others have awakened and have now an awareness. You know, an awareness is the first step, but we have to look at what are we doing? Are we educating everyone about the contributions and the history of African Americans, Indigenous people, Latinx people? If we don't know our history, if we don't acknowledge the contributions and the breadth that all people bring to our country, we're not going to be able to solve. We're not going to be able to look at the school system and be able to solve this. We're not going to be able to look at the justice system and solve this. We're not going to be able to look at the healthcare system and solve it, because foundationally, it's a much deeper issue.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. So I got to transition to the crisis text line. When you told me about it, I was blown away because, first of all, I didn't know it existed. But then when you told me, you know, approximately how many volunteers you all have, that really just blew my mind. So talk a little bit about the text line, how it got started and who it's for and that sort of thing.
So crisis text line is for anyone who is in need, anyone who is in crisis, however you define crisis. So we are a text-based organization that is free for anyone who texts in. We are data-driven, tech-enabled, and powered by an army of empathy volunteers. So these are volunteers who have been trained to do crisis de-escalation for anyone who texts in. Crisis text line is the only national and international free service that is available to anyone at any time, 24/7. We have trained over 30,000 volunteers. At any given time, we have 8,000 to 10,000 volunteers who are de-escalating and working with people in crisis. And these are children under the age of 13, all the way up to the elderly. Anyone who is in need for any reason, whatever they define as a crisis. So for some, it can be anxiety over homework, to other people who are at risk of suicide, who are contemplating suicide, who are actively engaging in suicide. So crisis text line serves a need, especially for our people of color, where we don't have enough mental health services for everyone. Anyone at any time for free can access crisis text line by texting 741-741. They can text help to 741-741. You can essentially text anything to 741-741, and you will be received by, or the texter will be received by a volunteer who is supervised by a mental health professional, and with the sole purpose of helping through text to de-escalate whatever that crisis may be.
Wow, that is amazing. So let me ask you, you train these volunteers, but are there mental health practitioners or clinicians that service support maybe for the volunteers that, you know, maybe there may be an issue that the volunteer can't necessarily handle because, you know, they're not a trained clinician, but do you have clinicians available to support them?
Absolutely. So every texter, when they text in, they first encounter the volunteer who's on their laptop. But every volunteer is supervised by a mental health professional who's supervising several volunteers at a time to ensure that everything that needs to happen with the texter is happening. They're ensuring that the volunteer feels supported. Each volunteer goes through about a 30-hour online training and is background screened. But we understand that our volunteers, we love them because they come from all walks of life, but not all are mental health professionals. And we know that they need the support, especially when our texters demonstrate that they are in serious need.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. So we got to take a break right here, but when we come back, I want to hear a little bit more about the crisis text line. All right, you all stay tuned for more conversation.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Y'all, welcome back to the Transformation Place. I am Gian Johnson, #1 wellness expert in the world, and today we are talking about headaches. Yes, because I'm pretty sure there has been an increase in headaches from all of this use of technology. So from staring at the screen and all of this blue light interaction, engagement, consumption is going to cause some migraines and some tension headaches. But I got good news. Peppermint oil is our friend. In the International Journal of Preventive Medicine, it was indicated that peppermint oil drops was just as effective as lidocaine drops in terms of nasal drip. Isn't that amazing? In another research article from Berlin, Germany, it was indicated that tension headaches can be treated with topical application of peppermint oil when compared to a placebo. And peppermint oil can be compared to acetylsalicylic acid, which is just a fancy word for aspirin. So, #1, to be transformed by this information, we are to go within to see if we can benefit from it. And if you've ever had a headache, you can absolutely benefit from this information. #2, go ahead and go to your nearest health food or whole food store and purchase some quality essential peppermint oil that can be applied topically. #3, go ahead and apply it and see if it helps you. If it does help you get rid of a headache, then you can just continue to use that and place it in your medicinal toolkit, just like all the other medicinal remedies that you have. Now, I will say, I am not a physician, so you are to consult your physician before trying out any new medicinal treatments or routines. All right. So I want to say I thank y'all so much for coming to the Transformation Place, where you come to be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Y'all, remember to press and fly. Press through your obstacles so that you can fly right on towards your destiny. We will see you next week. Peace and blessings.
With Nicole. Conversations with Nicole.
As doctors, we know African Americans are more likely
to acquire and die from complications of the COVID-19 virus.
Why?
Because people of color suffer from higher rates of chronic medical conditions
like diabetes and obesity,
high blood pressure,
heart and kidney disease,
and asthma.
All of these lower our immune system and the ability to fight off viruses.
Being an essential worker
and even using public transportation increase the risk of getting COVID-19.
But we can better protect ourselves and others from the virus.
Washing your hands,
not touching your face,
wearing a mask in public,
social distancing,
eating better, exercising, getting more sleep,
and visiting a primary care provider for health checks
will all make a difference. If you have questions, call the number on the screen
and visit our website.
Let's work together to save lives
and beat this pandemic.
Welcome back to Conversations with Nicole. First off, I have to thank Ms. Gian Jones, our #1 wellness expert, for that tip on peppermint oil. For those of you who may just be tuning in, I have been talking with Dr. Shairi Turner. We've been talking about childhood trauma, adverse childhood experiences, and we left off talking about the crisis text line, where you are serving as the transformation officer. So as transformation officer, tell me, what do some of those duties entail?
So as the Chief Transformation Officer, we are at a very important time in this organization. So right now we are preparing for what I believe we're serving, I guess I should say, as the mental health emergency room for so many Americans, especially people of color. What the transformation is about is our commitment within the organization for both our staff and our volunteers to bring equity to the center of what we do, to bring racial, gender equity to the core of everything we do in this organization. I believe that in the wake of George Floyd and the racial injustices, we have seen many organizations look at their staffing, their leadership, not just for diversity purposes. We want to be looking at how do the people in the organization feel within that organization. So that's what inclusion is. It's not about how many people you have, how many people of color exist within the organization, but how many people in the organization who are people of color feel included. How many women feel included, meaning that their voices are heard. Our transgender and LGBTQ staff, do they feel included? Do they feel like their voice matters? From our perspective, through this transformation, we are looking at how to bring equity to the center of the organization for everyone in everything that we do, in our human resources practices, in our hiring. How do we bring equity and cultural competency to our volunteers? That's the mission that I have, and along with the rest of our team and our organization, because it's not just me, it's about all the staff engaging in this equity journey.
I love that. I can actually, while you were speaking, I was envisioning maybe even the crisis text line being a trailblazer of sorts for others to, as a standard. You know, if you are, providing some type of training along those lines to get people to think about equity and inclusion, because it does impact our mental health. But seeing that injected in all of these systems within our culture, within American culture, within the world, I think would be just tremendous, and be a good start towards this social and racial equity conversation that, again, has, I think, been started with George Floyd and, a number of the other, racial incidences that we've seen. So, gosh, I promise you, I could really talk to you for hours, because, I consider myself to be a mental health advocate, especially for Black and Brown folks, because I think we have historically shied away from getting our mental health checkup, if you will, going to counselors and therapists. There's been a stigma. We, don't want our business in the street, that sort of thing. We think we could pray our troubles away, and not to negate the power of prayer, but, God also made psychologists and psychiatrists and counselors and therapists too. So, again, lots more to be said, but in the interest of time, I will just ask you my final question, which is, what is Shairi Turner's greater work? What is your greater work?
Wow. My greater work, I believe, is about advocating and finding the passion within people, whether it's within an organization of people, whether it's with individuals, but to advocate so that everyone at some level finds joy in the work that they do, finds joy in the space that they occupy. We are a nation of incredibly diverse individuals. And if we can engage in a dialogue together and have these types of conversations and get to know each other better, we will see that there's more commonality, there's more joy in the connection than in the differences.
Yes, that is actually one of my mantras as well. Us focusing more on our likenesses as opposed to our differences. So thank you for that. So I have to just tell you how much I really, truly appreciate you being with us today. And you definitely have to come back and let's have more conversation.
Thank you so very much, Nicole. I would love to come back at any time. It's been a joy to be here.
Awesome. My pleasure. All right. So we are going to close out in our indie artist feature spotlight with Mr. London Arrington with his original song entitled Pretty Brown. We will see you next time on Conversations with Nicole.
I've traveled to the far corners of the earth, and still nothing or no one compares to your worth. Girl, just to see you smile, pretty brown, pretty brown. I'd walk a country mile, pretty brown, with a bag of fresh fruit to dip in, pretty brown. Your beautiful chocolate skin, pretty brown. I love the sway of your subjects and verbs when you talk, pretty brown. And though I rarely see your kind on TV, oh no, pretty brown. You're my American beauty for sure. You're my pretty brown, pretty brown, pretty brown, my brown queen. Pretty brown, pretty brown, pretty brown, my brown queen. Pretty brown, pretty brown, pretty brown, my brown queen. Yeah. You're the prettiest queen I've ever seen. I love you, beautiful mind. Pretty brown, pretty brown. You're the treasure that I wanna find. Pretty brown, pretty brown. I love your beautiful big brown eye that hypnotize. Where your soul resides deep inside. I love the play in your hair. Pretty brown. I love the feel of the motherland there. Pretty brown. I love the look and the taste of your lips. Oh yeah, oh yeah. The fullness and curves of your